All right, welcome everyone to part 4 of my series, Great Influencers. Tonight we'll be discussing Chaim Soloveitchik and sponsored, as always, by Becky and Avi Katz, Le'ili Nishmat Yona Ben Harav Aryeh Leib. So you think back to the first 3 that influencers that we discussed, the Arizal, the Shalah, and the Baal Shem Tov. It's fair to say that Reb Chaim was almost the diametric opposite of all of them in many different ways, but particularly because Kabbalah played no role in his understanding of Torah. It's not to say he didn't access it on occasion, but he was, what we would say somewhat loosely, more rational, more intellectual, and more scientific. What do I mean by that? Well, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik pioneered an innovative approach to the study of Torah that captivated the Torah world, the yeshiva world. And it's nothing short of astonishing if we think about it, because the Torah has been studied for thousands of years. And yet Reb Chaim's approach is dubbed the Brisker method, the Brisker derech, swept the Torah world. It was not without its opponents or its scoffers. Even those who admire Reb Chaim could mildly poke fun at it, especially they hadn't been raised with it, and obviously his contemporaries were not raised with it. To give one example, Reb Chaim's mechutin, Reb Elia Pruzhiner, who was my Rebbe's, my grandfather's Rebbe, and Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik's, so to speak, other grandfather, he used to call Reb Chaim and his derech far matan Torah, noch matan Torah, meaning he learned before Reb Chaim gave the Torah, and now that Reb Chaim gave the Torah, it's after matan Torah, it's a totally different way. It was Reb Chaim's grandson, whom we call the Rav, Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, who repeatedly and perhaps a little hyperbolically said that in the modern world with educated students, no one would learn Torah if not for Reb Chaim's derech. So the Rav said in his eulogy for his uncle, Reb Velvel Soloveitchik, known as the Brisker Rav, one of the sons of Reb Chaim, that if not for Reb Chaim, the Torah would have been forgotten in Israel, and we would not have been able to disseminate Torah in the modern world. Well, even if we forgive the deference shown to one's grandfather, the Rav meant that university students educated in philosophy and mathematics and physics would not appreciate and would have rejected a Torah taught in the old traditional style. So I say it's somewhat hyperbolic. Most yeshiva world today applying Reb Chaim's methodology are not trained in philosophy, mathematics, and physics. Yet it is undeniable that Reb Chaim introduced to our world of Torah something new, something dynamic, something sophisticated, and I would say even cutting edge, a way of learning that is captivating, painstaking yet engrossing, that attracts the most brilliant minds to Talmud Torah. So what then exactly is Reb Chaim's derech? Why and how was it revolutionary? How did it catch on? Who were critics? And what was the nature of their objection? How influential is it today? So we first have to look, as I always try to do, at Reb Chaim, the personality, to understand his revolution and his influence. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik was born in 1853 in Volozhin to one of the most prominent rabbinic families in Lithuania. His father, Reb Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, known as the Beit HaLevi, was the assistant Rosh Yeshiva in the Yeshiva Volozhin. Eitz HaChaim was called, the Aim HaYeshivot, the mother, the paradigm of all yeshivot, that had been founded a half century earlier by Reb Chaim known as Reb Chaim Volozhiner. The Rosh Yeshiva at that time when Reb Chaim was born was the Netziv. The assistant was Reb Chaim's father, Reb Yasha Ber, the Beit HaLevi, and the two were strong personalities with very good yichus. The Netziv was married to Reb Chaim Volozhin, his granddaughter. The Beit HaLevi was the great-grandson of Reb Chaim Volozhin. In the mid-1850s, it was hard to have two powerful heads of any organization, but certainly yeshiva. Most of the time it never works. There's a famous Din Torah to try to accommodate both and facilitate a working relationship that had deteriorated over the years, mainly because of admission policies. The Netziv wanted sole authority, and the Beit HaLevi had brought in someone against the Netziv's wishes. The Netziv expelled him, and also fiscal management. So the Dayanim included Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, and the Beit Din ruled in favor of the Netziv, that he was to be the sole Rosh Yeshiva with authority over admissions, and the two shared management, but even that wasn't smooth or fully successful. And by the early 1860s, the Beit HaLevi left, and he became the Rav in Slutsk. Another major difference was their style of teaching. The Netziv was much more traditional, while the Beit HaLevi was a precursor of his son's more analytical approach. In any event, this was the milieu in which Reb Chaim was raised. He was educated by his father, who became the Rav of Brisk, Brest-Litovsk, which is a town now in Belarus, right on the Polish border. It would be wrong to think that the dispute between the Netziv and the Beit HaLevi was all personality centered, as it would be wrong to say that those did not play some role. But note the greatness of the individuals. Reb Chaim himself went to learn in Volozhin, in the yeshiva, notwithstanding that his father had left there. Not only that, Reb Chaim married the Netziv's granddaughter, Livsha, who was the daughter of Rav Rafal Shapira. So the families were united then in marriage, these two sides. Rav Rafal Shapiro, who was now the assistant Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin, he had replaced another son-in-law as assistant Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin. There's a lot of nepotism in Volozhin. Echoes of this are heard today in the great Panovich dispute, which was recently settled. So all this, the nepotism, the strong personalities, the genius, the difference in Darkei Limud would come to the fore in the early 1890s, when the Netziv in his 70s looked to appoint his successor and chose his son, Reb Chaim Berlin, who at the time was the chief rabbi of Moscow, and who until shortly before then had very little to do with the yeshiva aside from fundraising. The Netziv wanted to appoint his son, Reb Chaim Berlin, the Rosh Yeshiva over Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who had not only become the Sgan Rosh Yeshiva, but he became the most popular Rebbe in Volozhin owing to his new style. Well, it didn't end well, with the argument over succession occasionally turning bitter and violent, similar to Panovich in our day, and that played a primary role in the yeshiva's closing in 1892. That dispute, arguably even more than the dispute over the introduction of secular studies in Volozhin, which for reasons of propriety or narrative or spin gets popular attribution as the cause of Volozhin's closure. The fact is they had already allowed the study of Russian in Volozhin in an adjacent building, and you see other yeshiva hotels, Radin, they didn't have this problem, so it was just more than that. What needs to be said, of course, is that there was an open difference between the styles of the Netziv and Reb Chaim. Both were giving shiurim in Volozhin. Each gave shiur 3 days a week. Reportedly, Reb Chaim's shiurim attracted far larger crowds than those of the Netziv. So the Netziv's preference for his son to take over the yeshiva might have been related to this issue as well. Which derech halimud in Volozhin should prevail? Reb Chaim, of course, was noted for his genius, but also for his tremendous strength of character and boundless kindness and the yearning for truth, really an uncompromising truth. All deserve recognition. The Rav related that Reb Chaim had a Talmud who went off the derech named Yaakov Gromer. So I heard this from my Rebbe, Rabbi Chait, many years ago. I read it also in Rabbi Aaron Rakefet's 2-volume set on the Rav. Yaakov Gromer was another genius, a mathematician who, when he left Volozhin, he became an assistant to Albert Einstein. And the Rav met him when the Rav was studying at Humboldt University in Berlin, because Gromer, who was no longer observant, could not break away from the study of Gemara. It attracted his mind, so he asked the Rav to come learn with him, and the Rav did. Anyway, Gromer was once asked, who was a bigger genius, Reb Chaim or Einstein, and who else would be in a position to evaluate both? See, Einstein, this heard from my Rebbe, was a theoretician, but Gromer was the one who would concretize Einstein's theories and formulas in mathematical language. All right, I don't even know what I just said, but the Rav asked Gromer, who's a bigger genius, Reb Chaim or Einstein? And he thought about it, and then he answered, Reb Chaim had a sharper mind than Einstein. Not only that, Gromer was asked, who was the more moral person, Einstein or Reb Chaim? And Gromer said that Einstein was ethical, but he was an ethical dwarf compared to Reb Chaim. In another version I heard, he said that Reb Chaim had more ethics in his pinky than Einstein had in his whole body. Not a big shock if we know how Einstein treated women, including his wives. So another feature of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, once Reb Chaim ascertained what he perceived to be emet, the truth, he could not be budged on anything. So none of it was flip or impulsive. It would be an understatement to suggest that it was thought out. It was much more than that. Every idea, every thought, every policy, rigorously analyzed, probed, every idea and word dissected. So it makes perfect sense and is well known that Reb Chaim refused to publish anything in his lifetime, which became a brisker trait, for among other reasons, it's never entirely clear that emet, pure absolute truth, has been achieved, even if you think so at any given time. So maybe someone later can refute it, so why publish? Obviously, this quality does not inhibit most writers. Much, if not most, of Reb Chaim's Torah remains word of mouth. How didactic was Reb Chaim in his pursuit of Amita Shel Torah? When Reb Chaim heard an idea of his expressed, he would correct the reporter if even one word was changed, because every word had weight, had significance. That's truth. Here's an example of a person of integrity. When Reb Chaim, he had been learning in Volozhin, when he tried out to be a Ram, a Rebbe in Volozhin, they brought in an audience of a Rosh Yeshiva from other cities, including the Mir Rosh Yeshiva, to hear his shir, to see if he's worthy to teach in Volozhin. And Reb Chaim, with his derech, presented an ingenious shir in Masechet Yevamot, which in any event is a complicated Masechta. But at a certain point he stopped and he realized, he did, no one else did, that his svara was wrong. It was refuted by a comment of the Rambam in the Rambam's Perush Mishnayot in another Masechta altogether. Reb Chaim stopped the shir and he said his approach is all wrong, and he left the room. And this was his tryout. The Rosh Yeshiva present, so impressed by his integrity, insisted that he be appointed a Maggid Shir in Volozhin. That is emet, that is truth. Most people would not even mention the Rambam in another Masechta or try to explain it away. This is a pattern, by the way. I heard a similar story about one of Reb Chaim's Talmidim, Reb Shimon Shkop, who tried out to be a Rebbe in the Telze Yeshiva, So he was confronted with his dilemma. What level shear should he give? He has a top shear, grade A material, but he reasoned, Reb Shimon Shkop, that he can't match that level for every shear. So therefore, he decided to give his grade C shear. He gave his grade C shear, and he wasn't hired. And he went back and said to Reb Chaim, they didn't hire me. So Reb Chaim said, how could it be? He was a genius also. So he told them what he did. He didn't want to mislead them by thinking every shear that he gave is on that level. Reb Chaim intervened, and eventually he got the job. How insistent was Reb Chaim on his derech? So here's a famous story that Rav Soloveitchik related. Reb Chaim held that the obligation to hear Kriyat HaTorah, the Torah reading, is an individual one. It's not an obligation of the tzibur, it's an obligation of every individual. So when he would travel, he would sometimes exit the train, travel for a couple of days, he'd get off the train in a random Jewish city and try to find a minyan where he could hear the Torah reading on a Monday or a Thursday. Well, Reb Elia Pruzhiner once told his grandson, the Rav, show this Ramban to your grandfather, to Reb Chaim. The Ramban says on Daf Gimel, in the Dafei Arif, in Megillah, in the Milchamot Hashem, the Ramban writes that all the things listed in the Mishnah, including Kriyat HaTorah, Kulam Chavot HaTzibur Hein, they're all communal obligations. And the only individual obligation we have of any type of reading is that every individual is obligated to hear Megillat Esther. So Ramban says, Kulam Chavot HaTzibur Hein. So Reb Elia said, show this to your grandfather. And as Reb Elia predicted, it made no difference. He said, Reb Chaim, with his eisen of verta, with his iron words, will reinterpret even that Ramban to mean what he thinks it should mean. Some examples of Reb Chaim's tenacity are humorous in a bitter way. So when Volozhin closed in 1892, Reb Chaim was now jobless. He went to see his father in Brisk, and he hesitated whether to tell his father of the yeshiva's fate, because he was afraid for his father's health. So he held out, then he realized that he had to tell him, and as anticipated, the Beit HaLevi's health declined precipitously. So aggrieved was he by the closure of the yeshiva that he died within the year. The Netziv also, by the way, died within the year. Reb Chaim fell into a funk, into a depression. He would think and he would say out loud, he killed his father. He killed his father. He told his father this terrible news, and it killed him. No one could dissuade him. He just kept saying, he killed his father, he killed his father. In the middle of his depression, Reb Chaim was visited by one of his Talmidim, Reb Menachem Krakovsky, who later became the son-in-law of Reb Elia Pruzhiner, who was not yet Reb Chaim's Mechudim. And Reb Menachem Krakovsky would have been his Talmud in Volozhin, said they go for a walk. And on the walk, Reb Menachem was later the author of the Avodat HaMelech on the Rambam, another uncle of the Rav on the other side. Reb Menachem said to Reb Chaim, matter-of-factly, hey, I hear you killed your father. To which Reb Chaim responded, how can you say such a thing? And he gave all the reasons why he had to have told his father, including his father would have found out anyway. With that, Reb Chaim's depression lifted, and he resumed his normal activities. He'd already been appointed the Rav of Brisk when his father died. He was asked how he cured Reb Chaim, and Reb Menachem Krakovsky answered, I knew that once Reb Chaim gets an idea in his head, the only person who can talk him out of it is Reb Chaim. So I had him argue against himself. That's tenacity. Still another, Reb Chaim's position was that every Jew is exempt from all fasts except Yom Kippurim, maybe even Tisha B'Av, but all of the fasts you're not obligated to fast. A sort of a odd brisker minhag until today, because Reb Chaim said today we're all considered cholim and therefore exempt from fasting. Why that is so, given that we are stronger and a better constitution than prior generations, is a mystery. But in any event, on the day that his son Reb Moshe Soloveitchik married Pesha, Reb Elia Feinstein, Reb Pruzhner's daughter, Reb Chaim sent a messenger to her that she need not fast on her wedding day, in line with his general opinion. She sent the messenger back to her soon-to-be father-in-law that Prushna has its own fine rabbanim, meaning her father, and we do not need rulings from outside the city. They were all tough people. As the Rav of Brisk, Reb Chaim was no longer a Rosh Yeshiva. He didn't even teach in a yeshiva. He was occupied with communal matters, and he taught students from across Europe in his home, people who came to learn with him. He even set up a mini kola outside his home, and he gave shurim there. Reb Chaim's home, this I heard from my grandfather, Al Hashem, who was born in Brisk. I imagine his maternal grandparents lived there. Reb Chaim's home was like a community center. People would post flyers on his walls, outside his house, community announcements. Strangers routinely slept in his home, in his anteroom. Unwed mothers, God forbid, would leave their infants on his doorstep for Reb Chaim and his wife, Lifsha, to raise. And they did. His kindnesses were legendary. And it's important to speak of this because we talk of the Kalta Litvak, the cold Lithuanian, and the rationalist and the intellectual. Reb Chaim was playful. One story I heard that he saw a kid who was upset, and it turns out he was a Rav of Brisk, and it turns out that the other kids were playing a horsey, and he didn't have a chance to ride on a horse. They ran off before he could ride. He'd only been a horse. So Reb Chaim got down on all fours, and he said, "So I'll be your horse, climb on me." And the Rav of Brisk is riding around this little child on his back. He gave away his money so routinely to Aniyim that his wife had to take possession of his salary so they would have some subsistence. Reb Chaim moved out of his home to live in the shul, the great synagogue of Brisk. When most of Brisk burnt down, it would happen every decade or so, all the houses were made of wood. And he said, I can't sleep in a bed when everyone else is sleeping in the shul. I'll sleep with them. Very famously, he insisted that the Chevra Kadisha bury a poor woman who died right before the death of Chaim Zalman Lifshitz, who was close to Chaim as a lay leader of Brisk. He died also that same day, even though the Chevra Kadisha wanted to honor him first. But even though of Ein Mavir and Al Mitzvot, you can't pass up one mitzvah for another, and Reb Chaim insisted you have to bury the poor woman first, because that's the din. Famously, very famous story, one Erev Yom Kippur, he closed all the shuls in Brisk, told everybody by the multitudes to come to the great synagogue, and he said, we are not saying Kol Nidre until we raise 3,000 rubles to bribe the police chief of Brisk to save the life of a young Jewish Bundist who had been sentenced to death by the Tsar for revolutionary activities. And the Jews went home, they came on Yom Kippur, came back to shul with their money. Reb Chaim brought the money Yom Kippur night to the police chief, who then took a train to Warsaw to speak to the prosecutor. Reb Chaim on Yom Kippur signed an affidavit falsely attesting to the boy's innocence, and in fact the boy was saved. Only when that had been taken care of, it's already a few hours into Yom Kippurim, then they said Kol Nidre. The stories go on and on. So Chaim was not just an intellectual, but a tzaddik. On his tombstone in Warsaw is inscribed the very first line at the top of all his other accolades. It says, Rabbeinu Hagadol, our great teacher, Rav HaChesed, master of kindness, Sar HaTorah, the Prince of Torah. So with that introduction, let's try to understand, or at least describe at first, the Torah revolution of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. So it was first in Slutsk that Reb Chaim received his Torah education, and his derech was forged, although it was obviously honed over many years. It built on his father's approach, but Reb Chaim credited a Melamed, happened to be a Slonim Chassid, named Rav Avram Malach, with introducing this conceptual approach to learning. We can illustrate at the very beginning by citing a Yerushalmi in the 16th parak of Shabbat. So the Gemara there says, "Ha'osek b'Talmud ein lecha midah gedola mizo." A person who is involved in the study of Talmud, Gemara, there's no greater endeavor than all of this. Why? So the Karbana Eda states, what does it mean to be osek b'Talmud? It means lotet lev lehavin stimat tamei mishnayot mahem, to understand to its core the reasoning implicit in every din in the Mishnah, ukashehem sotrim zed zeh, and when they contradict each other, yavil taretz sheyu shtehem kayamot, we'll know how to resolve it so we're able to confirm, to validate both opinions. That is to say, people often think that understanding a machloket involves determining who is right, or better, if we posit elu ve'elu divrei Chaim, that they're both right in a broad Torah sense, who is more logical? And we'll try to do that by referencing other areas, or analogizing one case to another, or looking for similarities or common denominators or differences. All this, for the most part, is outside Reb Chaim's system, which strove through precise analysis and especially classification to determine what is the nukudat hamachloket. What's the point at issue? The essential point at issue between the two sides. There are more simplistic methods. In the worst iteration of the simplest method, it really is the method of the simpleton, but this is adopted by Gretz and by Zachariah Frankel, and it endures today in sort of the conservative movement, the positive historical school, that Beit Hillel ruled this way because he favored the common man, and Beit Shammai the other way because he supported the elites. This analysis is not only wrong, not only anti-intellectual, but Briskers would hold it borderline heretical, or to say that someone ruled X because he ruled similarly in another area, or the traditional approach when confronting two passages that seem to conflict with one another, you have to redefine one, or you change one fact so that the two are then harmonized. So understand the Brisker Derech. We'll give examples, of course, because otherwise we're just talking in the abstract. You have to understand the nomenclature as well. To understand a machloket, in our yeshiva, I learned with Rabbi Chet, Shlutim be well, Shiva B'nai Torah, it was known as breaking down a machloket. You have to ascertain the raw elements, beginning with this. Reb Chaim's question never was why, but always what. What are they arguing about? What is the Gemara saying? Not why does each person have this opinion, on what is their opinion based? So what is it? Like I said, it's difficult to describe, and so most accounts use the same cliches. What's the Brisker Derech? It's rigorous conceptualization, categorization, precise definitions, analytical. Both Reb Chaim's methodology and terminology were unique, especially what's known as the two dinim, essentially two principles that look the same but are really not, and they help us define the point at issue in a machloket. So a classic distinction is between the gavra and the chefza. Does the din, does the halacha relate primarily to the person or to the object? So this is actually taken explicitly from the Gemara in Nedarim, as the Gemara itself explains. What's the difference between a neder and a shavua? They're both oaths. They're both verbal means of either committing to something or, in our context, prohibiting something upon ourselves. So the Gemara says that a neder is an iser cheftza. When you make a neder, that konam, I will not have any hana from this particular item, a neder renders the object forbidden to the noder. It's a din in the cheft in the object. Whereas a shavua is an iser gavra, meaning a person cannot do that action. It's not that the fruit becomes asur, but it's asur for you to eat that fruit. Other approaches, Reb Chaim would ask, a particular halacha, is it a new halacha or is it an extension of an existing one? Take Tosefet Shabbat, for example. We add to Shabbat before Shabbat starts and after it ends. Is that a new halacha with its own rules, or is it an extension of Kedushat Shabbat? And there are ramifications to this. Take another one. The principle of osek b'mitzvah poter min mitzvah, that a person who's involved in one mitzvah is exempt from doing another. So what does exempt mean? Does exempt mean that there's no obligation at all to do the other mitzvah, such that if you do the other mitzvah, you're not yotzei, because you're not obligated in it? Or Reb Chaim would say that it's usher to do it because you're doing one already? Or do we say osek b'mitzvah poter min mitzvah means that you're still obligated, but you're an onus because of you're coerced. You can't do it because you're doing something else, and thus you're exempt. All these things matter. It's not just idle philosophical speculations about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Each distinction is going to have halachic ramifications, again, in like odd cases, odd fact patterns. Take a famous Hakira of Reb Chaim. I think it's either the first or the second one that Rav Zevin brings in his Sefer Ishim V'Shitot. What's the mitzvah of bir chametz, of burning, of getting rid of our chametz? And I'll note parenthetically, there's a whole discussion. What bracha do we make? We make a bracha al bir chametz, for the destruction of the chametz, instead of leva'er chametz, to destroy it. It's not the action, it's the result we're making the bracha on. So what is the mitzvah of bir chametz? Is it to destroy the chametz, meaning in action, or is it to ensure that a person has no chametz in his possession on Pesach? I mean, it's not the action of the mitzvah, but the mitzvah is to produce a certain result. The difference is that Rabbi Yehuda in the Gemara held that bir chametz requires sreifa. Bir chametz must be performed by burning, whereas the Chachamim held chametz could be destroyed in any way. So what is the machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim? So Reb Chaim explained. According to Rabbi Yehuda, bir chametz is a din in the cheftza. The object has to be burnt, has to be destroyed. Burnt, according to the Chacham, meaning destroyed through this method of burning. The chametz has to become an item that's saruf. According to Chachamim, the isser is in the person, that he have no chametz in his possession, so you could do that by any means. What's the difference really? There's a difference. One difference is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the ashes are mutter. Like any other objects that are destroyed through sreifa, the nisrafin are permitted for use. Whereas according to the Chachamim, the ashes are forbidden because they're ashes of chametz and must be buried of or disposed of. I'll give you another example. The odd case of Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbat. So when do we actually destroy the chametz? So we destroy chametz on Shabbat because you can't burn it, but that's and we're eating chametz Friday night. We usually do it by flushing it. That's only means at our disposal. And yet on Friday we'll burn the chametz as well. Why are we burning the chametz? It's because we want to satisfy both opinions. Rabbi Yehuda says we can only destroy chametz through burning. Chacham say anytime. So now on Friday we'll do a almost symbolic burning of the chametz because we're still using chametz at the time through burning. Whereas on Shabbat we'll follow the Chachamim. Reb Chaim also expanded the concept of chefza, an object, in ways that we would not anticipate. So we'll speak of a chefza shel tefillah, the text of davening being a substance and not just a masa that we do. The distinctions between the masa hamitzvah and the kiyum hamitzvah, the action, the performance, and the fulfillment. So, for example, many times they happen simultaneously. What's the masa mitzvah, kiyum mitzvah of eating matzah or taking the lulav? They're simultaneous. You eat, that's the masa. You eat, that's the kiyum mitzvah. Sometimes not. Sometimes there's a delay. So as Reb Chaim pointed out, what's the masa mitzvah of kriyat shema? It's reading the shema. What's the kiyum ha-mitzvah? The actual fulfillment through the reading of the shema is kabbalat ol malchut shamayim, accepting the yoke of God's kingship upon us. Reb Chaim would ask, Do we apply a general rule here? Or is there a special rule for situation? Is something a cause? Meaning, for example, a shor becomes a muad, a goring ox, through 3 gorings. We shouldn't know of it. Is that a cause, meaning 3 gorings make a shor muad? Or is it just an effect? Is it an indication that an ox that gores 3 times is a muad? All these things have differences, practical differences. And it's important to note these chakirat are not distinctions without a difference. One thing we always try to do, we ask is, what's the nafkamina? What's the difference between the 2 opinions in the Nukudat HaMachloket, in application, in unusual cases, in understanding different subjects? We'll try to find out what's the mechayev of the mitzvah, what's the obligating factor that compels us to do a mitzvah. Not that God commanded us, of course. The mechayev of shachrit, for example, is hanei tzachama, sunrise. All these things get the mitzvah down to its raw elements. Reb Chaim saw things that others did not see. I'll give you a simple example, not just to go too far afield, but these are easy to understand. So Allah, if a person forgets to daven Ma'ariv Motzei Shabbat, he forgets, let's say falls asleep, Sudash Yoshi doesn't wake up till the morning, forgets. There's a din of Tashlumin. Whenever you forget a tefillah, not b'mezid, you have to make it up. You have to compensate for the missing tefillah by davening the next tefillah twice. In this case, the person forgot to daven Motzei Shabbat, he has to daven Shmoneh Esrei twice for Shachrit. The question is, what about Atachon Antanu, which is the Havdalah, the text of Havdalah we say in tefillah? When do you say it? In the first or the second? Logic would tell us, and this is the psak of the Mishnah Brura, that you say Atachon Antanu in Shachrit if you did not make Havdalah alakos, or didn't hear alakos, you have to say Atachon Antanu in the second tefillah, because that's the Tashlumin. Meaning you have an obligation to daven Shachrit, that comes first, and then you have an obligation of Tashlumin, you say it second. You say the Havdalah, Atachon Antanu in the second Shachrit. All right, it makes sense. Reb Chaim disagreed. Reb Chaim said no, because there's a special din. It's not just a din in Tashlumin. There's a special din that Atachon Antanu, since it constitutes Havdalah in the davening, it has to be recited in the first Tfilat Chol that a person utters after Shabbat. So these are simple areas that illustrate his derech. You get to Erevin, you get to Sukkah, you get to Yevamot, your head can spin. It's extremely complicated. And at the heart of the Brisker approach to the Talmud, of course, is the Rambam. So much so that one would think he was Lithuanian, not Spanish. I joke, but I heard this story once. One of my former members in the Kew Gardens Hills, his sons were learning Chafetz Chaim, and he went to with his son, and he overheard 2 boys talking, to high school students talking, one saying to the other, the Svardim, they've never produced a Gaon on the level of the Rambam. Thinking the Rambam's a Lithuanian and not a Sfardi. The Rambam signed his name, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon HaSfardi. The words of the Rambam, really all Rishonim, but especially the Rambam, were dissected along these lines. Others as well idealized the Rambam because he was precise, scientifically precise in his language. Thus we can learn what the Rambam said and what he didn't say, and where he said it, and why he repeated something. So for example, just to give a modern application, a lot is made today about a person who wants to act like Shevet Levi, who's exempt from communal needs, exempt from working, exempt from the army, anyone whose heart moves him in that place, so he could act as if he's Shevet Levi. But the Rambam, and people say that, well, that's why you have to exempt the Bnei Yeshiva from fighting because they want to be like Shevet Levi. But the Rambam wrote that at the end of Seder Zrah, at the end of Matnon Aniyim. He didn't write that in Hilchot Melachim of the laws of war. So where the Rambam writes something matters, Reb Chaim said to us. Or to give another less polemical example, the Rambam twice mentions the obligation to light Shabbat candles. Once he calls it a din in Oneg Shabbat, another a din in Kavod Shabbat, meaning the enjoyment of Shabbat, or the honor we show Shabbat, and Kavod Shabbat is that there's an obligation. Every home, Rambam says, V'hiyeh ner daluk, there should be a candle lit, which by now, it should awaken our curiosity. Why did the Rambam say the mitzvah is lahadlik? Why did he say here that it's v'yeh ner daluk? And why twice? So here, one principle we can derive is that all the things that we do, lichvod Shabbat, are those things that we do before Shabbat starts. And all those things that we do for Oneg Shabbat are things that happen on Shabbat itself. So which is it primary? Is lighting Ner Shabbat, is that a din in Kavod Shabbat or Oneg Shabbat? That too matters. Think of these cases. Is the essential obligation of Ner Shabbat to light, meaning a Masa Hadlaka, or is it to have a Ner Daluk, a lit candle, or a house that's not dark? Is lighting therefore a functional act, just to produce light and no darkness, show and by it? Or is it a ritual act, a mitzvah by which we usher in the Kedushat Shabbat? Well, one difference would be, one nafkamina, can a Gentile light? Can you tell a Gentile to light Shabbat candles for you? If the purpose of Ner Shabbat is via Ner Daluk, you should have a lit candle, and that your house not be dark, then why not? But if it's a ritual act, then there's no agency for a Gentile. You can't make a guy or shaliach. Or if you have lights lit earlier in the day, with the chandelier on, can you just keep them on and designate those as Ner Shabbat? Or do you have to extinguish those lights and light specifically for Shabbat? That's a chakira. Which is it? I will tell you, is of little interest to Reb Chaim. Little interest, as we'll see in a moment. And since the Rambam omitted the Gemara's discussions and just brought the final halacha, now we know why it was ideal for Reb Chaim's derech. Here's another very fascinating question. Netilat Yodayim, can a monkey pour water on your hands? You have a monkey, pour water. For you. The Mechaber in Kuf Nun Tet, Sif Yud Bet, brings both opinions. Some say it was prohibited, others say it was permitted. What's the machloket? So Reb Chaim explained, those who prohibited it, it's because Netilat Yadayim requires koach gavra, the strength of a person, a human being. Those who permitted it, based on a Mishnah in the first parak of Masechet Yadayim, it's because it requires just koach notel. You need the strength of a pourer. You need a notel, a pourer, as opposed to a gavra, a person. Well, if you say koach notel, a monkey's good. A monkey can be a notel. A monkey can't be a gavra, a person, last I checked. What should intrigue us by now in the derech of Reb Chaim is how, to use a secular analogy, it makes studying Gemara like solving a puzzle or a riddle. It's engaging. It's even, dare I say, fun. You can't just say, Gav Rechefza, call it a day. You have to defend it. You have to show why such a distinction exists and why it matters. So now we can understand maybe a little better why the Rav said that without Reb Chaim, it would be impossible to study Talmud. Reb Chaim, the Rav said, rescued, for example, Yoredeya from being all about pots and pans to being a subject of incredible sophistication and depth. Yoredeya is not just about bliot and Plato, you absorb, you exude. No. There's such science in it, such chachma in it, to understand the basic elements. And Chaim did it for the whole Torah. Kodshim, Tarot, Shabbat, Tefillah, Pesach, Kiddushin, etc. I'll tell you, it's not easy. And the definitions are very precise, and Chaim didn't explain everything. The derech means that when it's conveyed to us, we have to apply it without having any specific guidance as to the area we're studying. I remember in yeshiva, someone would suggest an approach, and Rabbi Chait would say, you're describing it, you're not defining it. Meaning there's a difference between a description and a definition, which I learned to mean that a description is about the subject, but a definition is the subject. A description is from the outside looking in, whereas a definition is on the inside looking out. A definition is an essence. And sometimes we would just have to think quietly, think. What's the Nakudat HaMachloket? What is each side saying? What are the elements of this, the one element of a particular mitzvah or halacha that the two sides are arguing over? And then you have to redefine. And then years later, redefine it again. Reb Chaim had notes from his shiurim in Volozhin. He was constantly amending and revising it until the language was exact, pure. What I offered here was just a flavor. Multiply this by thousands and thousands of examples, and the way we study Talmud is completely redefined. Because everything was so clear and well delineated, we can better understand the quip of the Beit HaLevi, Reb Chaim's father, who was asked to define the difference between him and his son. And the Beit HaLevi said, well, someone asked me a question, I answer it. I'm happy and he's happy. He's happy because he asked a good question, and I'm happy because I answered it. When someone asks Reb Chaim a question, nobody's happy because he shows them why their question is not really a question. So the questioner walks away unhappy, he didn't have a question, and Reb Chaim walks away unhappy because what did he really accomplish? Well, maybe now we can understand also some of the criticism of Reb Chaim's derech. Very famously, one of the most famous critics was the Rav of Slutsk, the Ridbaz, Rabbi Yaakov David Volovsky, died 1913, who wrote in the introduction to the Beit Ridbaz, very cryptically but very pungently, he lamented that in his era, then, nishtana iyun haTorah lagamre. The whole way we study Torah intensely has changed. And what replaced it? He says, Bimkomo himtzi rav echad limud hakimia. So one rabbi invented the study of chemistry. Hamevinim, those who understand it, call it chemi, chemistry. Varbei korm higayon, others call it logic. V'zehu ra lonu me'od me'od. This has been terrible for all of us. Ki hu ruach zara min achutz, hichnisu lator shebapeh. It's an alien, a foreign wind coming from the outside that he's inserted into the oral Torah. V'lo zohi haTorah mesura lana mimoshe mipia gvura. And this is not the Torah that was transmitted to us from Moshe, from God. Very strong, very harsh words. And then he added, the Ridbaz did, that this approach has spread among the Bnei Yeshiva, who are still machzikim ksat gemara biyadam. They still hold a gemara a little in their hands, but this type of limud will not bring a person to tahara and cannot protect those who learn it. All right, the Ridbaz was unique. He left Slutsk. He wound up in Chicago. He was very critical. Wherever he went, he was critical. He left Chicago. He blasted American Jewry in the second decade of the last century. He went to Tzvat and he died a few years after he got there. He didn't seem happy, but nonetheless, that was his criticism. I note parenthetically that the very first periodic table of elements was published in the 1860s. So in fact, it was in the air. And the analogy is really not that far off. What the Slutska Rav rejected, though, was the idea of reducing an object to its basic elements enables you to understand them more, not less. And that's what Reb Chaim's revolution wrought. When you understand something to its core, like you understand the elements, all the chemical elements, and you see the combinations, and you see what the different combinations produce, you understand it better. You don't understand it worse. That's what Reb Chaim did. That's what the Slutska Rav could not accept. Others, on occasion, found it somewhat forced. Did the Rambam really mean everything attributed to him? Is that what he really had in mind? Sometimes the effort to fit everything into a neat box seems contrived, but maybe that means that we haven't achieved Amita Shel Torah. The Chazon Ish himself did not approve of this approach. Some yeshivot did not embrace it, but the mainstream did. And Reb Chaim's main disciples carried it forward. His son Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, his son Rav Elbel Soloveitchik, the Brisker Rav, Reb Baruch Ber Leibovitz, Reb Shimon Shkop, Reb Isser Zalman Meltzer came to Israel. Later, the Rav, Reb Soloveitchik, Reb Chanan Wasserman, and others as well. There was another downside to Reb Chaim's derech, and that is in the realm of psak halacha, deciding what the halach is. Reb Chaim rarely answered halachic questions because he was able to see all sides. Each side had a compelling logic, so how can you decide? He once asked the Chavetz Chaim, how is it possible for him to choose among the Rishonim and Achronim in the Mishnah Brura? And the Chavetz Chaim said he davened over it, but he also learned each area 36 times. He reviewed the laws of Shabbat 5 years before putting it down to writing. But Brisk had its own dayan. Reb Simcha Rieger, because Reb Chaim did not paskin. He couldn't. Simcha Rieger answered all questions. To give an example, in one complex Aguna case, Reb Chaim sent the question by telegram to Rav Yitzchak Khan Inspector in Kovna and asked him to respond in one word, Muteret, Asura. Is she permissible to marry or forbidden? And give no reasons. Because if Rav Yitzchak Khan gave reasons, Reb Chaim said he would argue about it. And the matter needed a decision. And so at the time, and this is general, all the yeshiva worlds over a century ago, getting smicha was almost a concession. It was an unfortunate requirement to become an active rabbi. Rav Soloveitchik in Ish Halacha, Halachic Man, which his father and grandfather were role models and paradigms, wrote that Halachic Man is similar to the mathematician who measures, delimits, quantifies, and thus renders religious subjectivity into something concrete and objective. And here's the key point. Halachic man is not particularly concerned about the possibility of actualizing the norm in the concrete world. They much prefer the svara, the idea, the logic, than to the real world results. Well, here's another example. Reb Chaim once received a letter from Chaim Berlin, who was then in Israel, the Netziv son. The Shemitah year, desperate, can he find the leniency to support the heter mechira? Reb Chaim answered, who says we're supposed to find the heter? Maybe we should find grounds for an isser, or maybe just uncover what the halacha is. Reb Chaim was influential in other ways as well. Another consequence of the influence of Reb Chaim and his derech was the rejection by much of the yeshiva world that followed his derech of the study of Musar, another stream that was permeating the Torah world at the time. It was not only perceived as bittul Torah, it was also superfluous for a yeshiva student, and probably wishful thinking as well, but also contradictory to Reb Chaim's worldview. Musar dealt with perfection of emotions and human weaknesses and temptation, but you could do that through knowledge and cognition of halacha. In one quote at Trivit Reb Chaim, he said, Musar is for sick people. In Brisk, we're healthy. We don't need it. All right, maybe it could be wishful thinking. Reb Chaim's minhagim, hanhagot, until today, attracted a broad following. Reb Chaim's own customs that often deviated from the mainstream, that influenced generations also. Others entered our world through his grandson, the Rav. Reb Chaim's own method of hadlakat ner Chanukah, that you didn't say the brachot first. You only said Shasanisim with the Brechat Odo when you saw a lit candle. He didn't indent the challah with a knife before cutting it on Shabbat. The challah needs to be shalem. He was fanatic about any chola eating on Yom Kippurim. No shiurim, everybody eats fully. Just that he was very machmir for pikuach nefesh on Shabbat. Machmir. Reb Chaim refused to swallow his own saliva on Yom Kippurim. He rejected the use of microscopes to determine status of objects, bugs, tefillin, because that's not how halacha is made. Halacha is the naked eye. If we could describe him in 2 words, Reb Chaim was all Torah, all Torah. So he once walked out of an Aguda conference when he said that he only knows Torah. He hasn't heard one word of Torah, so why is he sitting there? In general, he was not keen on organizations because he felt you don't vote on Torah, even policy. Whatever the emet is, that's what you have to follow. So very famously, a rabbinic conference he attended decided to ban Arelim, uncircumcised Jews, from being registered with the Russian government as Jews in order to pressure miscreants to circumcise their children. Reb Chaim objected, and he said, an Arel, I know, cannot eat a Karm Pesach, but he still remains a Jew. So what halachic basis are you banning them from being registered as Jews? What does it mean to be all Torah? So his great Talmud, Reb Baruch Ber, someone showed him a newspaper headline that Reb Chaim had died, and he was unmoved. He had no reaction. When two people told him, he broke down in tears, and he said the Torah does not give any credibility to newspapers, only to Eidim, to witnesses. That's all Torah. This idea of all Torah helps explain the Briskers' passionate objection to Zionism. Where is it in the Torah? Does the Shulchan Aruch discuss the ramifications of a secular Jewish state? No. So on the one hand, that's very limiting. On the other hand, it's quite consistent. And to a large extent, the Briskers have still not made their peace with the state of Israel. Some say that Reb Chaim was not implacably opposed to Zionism, but he couldn't wrap his head around the fact that so many Jews antagonistic to Torah were leaders of the movement. He had a very well-known run-in with the secretary of the Jewish Council of Brisk, one Zev Begin, years before Menachem was born, who wanted to hold a memorial for Theodor Herzl in the great synagogue of Brisk. Reb Chaim refused to allow it, and he locked the door, and Zev Begin broke the lock, and the event took place. What's all Torah? Yecheskel Abramsky, another Talmud, the Chazon Yecheskel, said, you could not characterize Reb Chaim as compassionate or cruel or kind or tough or generous or stingy or angry or patient. Whatever the Torah required in a particular situation, that is who he was, completely grounded in Torah. Well, just to conclude, Reb Chaim had 4 children, Reb Moshe and Reb Yitzchak Zev being the most well-known. Another son, Reb Yisrael Gershon Soloveitchik, was murdered with his family during the Holocaust. He had a daughter, Sarah, her husband, a Ger Chassid named Reb Tzvi Hirsch Glickson, also murdered by the Nazis. Reb Chaim fled to Minsk during World War I, returned to Brisk, and then he sought medical treatment in Warsaw. He took up residence in Otvas, right outside Warsaw, where he died on the 21st of Av, 1918, age 65. True to form, a machloket erupted between the leaders of Otvatsk and Warsaw as to where Chaim should be buried. Both wanted him. A din Torah was hastily arranged. It was ruled that Chaim would be buried in Warsaw, where he's buried in the old cemetery, right next to his grandfather-in-law, the Netziv. What lives on is his Torah, despite the detractors. I mean, what happened? The Chavetz Chaim in Radin was forced to bring in Rav Naftali Trapp, whose style was very similar to Reb Chaim, to give shiurim in Radin in place of the Rosh Yeshiva. Because the benches of Radin emptied, students flocked to Brisk. Reb Aryeh Leib Malin, who was a Talmud of Reb Shimon Shkop, said of Reb Chaim that our generation, Zachinu la'or b'tkufatenu zot acharna, we merited the Or Gadol of Reb Chaim of Brisk. He was Kimalach Mimarom, like an angel sent on high to uncover for us the depth of the Torah, to learn Dakut, Omek Halacha, to learn the fine details, the profundity of Halacha. He opened Sharim Rechavim, wide gates, Sharei Ara, V'nitgalu Orot, Omek Prima Torah. He revealed the inner concepts of Torah. As one student in Radin, Reb Mordechai Zuckerman, said of Reb Chaim, it seems that the Hashgacha felt that for the continued elevation of this generation, we would need Nitzrachu L'Ti'imat Mitikuto Shel HaTorah B'darko Shel Reb Chaim. We have to be able to taste the sweetness of Reb Chaim's Torah, something prior generations did not. Torah is always studied, but Torah with the derech of Reb Chaim enriches us until today. Yehi Zichro Baruch. I thank you all for joining. I want to say that next time in part 5, we'll discuss, moving it away somewhat from what we've had up to now, one of the great influences of Jewish life in the last half millennium, one Theodore Herzl. I thank you all for joining.